Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. President Biden's promising to build a port to get help to Gaza. But is it meaningless theater or a real shift in the U.S. approach to Israel's war on Gaza? Let's get to the bottom line. To hear Israel tell this story, the war in Gaza is going according to plan. Even as Israeli leaders admit they're far away from their stated goal of destroying Hamas, but according to plan includes the killing of more than 31,000 people, mostly innocent women and children. According to plan also means turning more than 2 million Palestinians, who were refugees to start with, into a homeless, destitute, and starving population. And according to plan, offers no glimmer of hope that the future is going to be any brighter after the decimation of Gaza's infrastructure and schools and hospitals and bakeries, everything. The United States, as Israel's most important ally and benefactor, has resisted calling for a complete ceasefire. And while nudging Israel's military to be more cautious about killing tens of thousands of innocent people, Washington hasn't conditioned any of its aid or support on getting Israel to change course. Now the U.S. and its partners are going to build a port into Gaza that Israel can't easily block. But it's unclear whether it will ease the massive humanitarian crisis. It's meant to be a sign of something different. But what exactly? Endless war? Especially since, as of the time of this show, there still are no signs of a temporary truce. Today, we're talking with a U.S. senator who was one of the first and few American politicians to act on the man-made humanitarian catastrophe unfolding before our eyes. U.S. Senator from Maryland, Chris Van Hollen. Senator, thank you so much for joining us. Let me just start this out and say, I watch a lot of C-SPAN. C-SPAN is where we watch those of you in the House and those of you in the United States Senate debate issues. You're one of the few who has gotten up and talked in human ways about those people suffering in Gaza. I hadn't heard President Biden talk in the similar kinds of terms until about 2 weeks ago when the King of Jordan, King Abdullah, came to town. There have been very few people who put this in human terms. So I want to ask you, what is the gap between your frame that you have and that you brought to this and many of your colleagues?
Well, Steve, first of all, it's good to be with you. And as I've said many times before, in the aftermath of the horrible Hamas attacks on Israel of October 7th, Israel was, of course, within its right to defend itself. But that does not justify the humanitarian catastrophe that we're witnessing in Gaza, a man-made humanitarian catastrophe where we've got over 15 kids who have starved. 4 out of 5 of the hungriest people in the world right now are in Gaza, and the huge parts of the population are on the verge of starvation. So, you know, I am urging my colleagues to look at this from a human point of view. We've been pushing President Biden to do the same. I was pleased to see President Biden and Vice President Harris speak out more forcefully on this issue. I was pleased to see the president decide to do airdrops and now a seaport, but that is not enough. We have to insist, not just in words, but with all the levers of our power and influence, that the Netanyahu government open up corridors to allow more aid to get to starving people.
So we just heard the President of the United States in a major State of the Union address talk about a multi-nation effort to get more aid and medical supplies to those in Gaza. I guess my question to you is, you know, having reported on this now for almost 5 months, why is the United States so impotent? Because when you look at when we first started, we knew Israel was blocking aid and supplies going in. By textbook definition, that's a war crime. And when you sort of see it, the president succeeded in getting 8 trucks at the beginning of this crisis into this. You know, that looks, I don't know what other word to call it other than pathetic. So is there some sense in the Biden White House and among those that you talk to in the national security establishment that the world is watching this and it's not a good picture?
I think people understand that this looks really bad, not just to see so many people in desperate straits, but the fact that the United States continues to be rebuffed by the Netanyahu government. President Biden has called upon Prime Minister Netanyahu time and time again, let more trucks in, let more relief in. We have to have some light at the end of the tunnel with a 2-state solution. And time after time gets almost no real meaningful results, some incremental progress. So that clearly looks bad around the world. And what has to happen is, in addition to jawboning Prime Minister Netanyahu, the United States needs to use other tools in our toolbox to not just insist, but to say, if you continue to ignore us, if you continue to rebuff these requests, there will be consequences.
You know, one of the things I've heard you talk about on the floor is a national security memorandum. I'm going to read it for National Security Memorandum on Safeguards and Accountability with respect to transferred defense articles and defense services. This is basically a memorandum, an order that when we ship military supplies and munitions to allies or to those in need, that they're going to be used responsibly and within a code of conduct that we would find to be within humanitarian norms. You've been talking about this, and you said you see textbook war crimes in place. Do we have a problem in this country of a complicity with war crimes that are being deployed right now as we speak, using U.S. military munitions and bombs, et cetera?
Well, look, clearly what is happening right now in Gaza is not consistent with best practices for reducing civilian harm. Whether or not they've tripped over international humanitarian law is going to be a factual question that people have to look at. But there's zero doubt, Steve, that you have huge numbers of unnecessary and avoidable civilian casualties, number one. Number two, as you said, the deliberate effort to prevent humanitarian assistance from reaching people is, as I said, on the floor of the Senate, a war crime. So the United States needs to be using all the levers of its influence to address the situation. And that is why we've called on the president to do this. Now, National Security Memorandum 20 is a really good new tool if it will be utilized. This came about because I, along with 18 of my Senate colleagues, introduced an amendment to the National Security Supplemental that had funding for Ukraine, for Israel, had humanitarian aid. We introduced an amendment laying out the terms and the framework that later were incorporated into the National Security Memorandum 20. I worked with the administration for weeks on this, and it will finally say that when the United States transfers military assistance and weapons to another country, it could be Israel, it could be Ukraine, any country, that country has to commit and promise in writing that it will use those weapons in accordance with international humanitarian law, and that it will facilitate and not arbitrarily impede the delivery of humanitarian assistance into any conflict zone where that country is using U.S. weapons. I should also say it has a very big reporting requirement that will require the Biden administration to tell Congress about whether or not those other measures are being complied with and whether they've been complied with since January 1 of last year. So that covers the war in Gaza. It also covers the war in Ukraine.
You know, one of the split screens in my mind, Senator, is on one hand, you on the floor of the Senate talking about the devastation and the problems that occur if UNRWA is not funded, if the United States and other allies do not fund UNRWA, because it not only services the Gazans in all sorts of ways, but a broader population of refugees. The other side is the decision in Israel to expand 3,400 settlements in the West Bank. And I'm just sort of saying, wow, very interesting timing there. We have a major crisis going on. I'm just interested in whether, as you look at it, where's the humanity at this moment and the introspection on the moment and I guess the question about when you're looking at a long-term equilibrium that is fair and just to the Israeli side and fair and just to the Palestinian side, how does shutting UNRWA down, 16,000 employees in Gaza, and at the same time seeing a settlement expansion decision of 3,400 new homes in the West Bank, how does that sit with you?
Well, it's really outrageous, and this should make President Biden very, very angry, both in terms of expanding settlements and making it even harder to achieve what the president has acknowledged is the only viable long-term solution to secure Israel's security and to give dignity and self-determination to the Palestinian people, which is a two-state solution. If you continue to have settlements in the West Bank, that becomes impossible. With respect to UNRWA in Gaza, They are the delivery mechanism for humanitarian assistance. There are 13,000 UNRWA employees who helped run schools, at least before the war, when kids were going to school, health services. Now, there's this allegation, which even if it's true, even if it were true that up to 14 members out of that 13,000 organization were involved in the Hamas attacks of October 7th, they need to be punished. They need to be held accountable.
And to be fair, UNRWA itself has done, the United Nations does an investigation and said these accusations may in fact be true.
Yeah, they're looking into this right now, and they've already fired those folks. And obviously, if they're guilty, they need to be held fully accountable. I don't think many Americans really know what UNRWA is. So the UNRWA operation in Gaza is headed by a guy called Scott Anderson. He is a U.S. Army veteran. I spoke to him just the other day via video. There is no collaboration between UNRWA and Hamas. This is a myth generated by Netanyahu and others, whose goal since at least 2017 has been to get rid of UNRWA, not just in Gaza, but in the West Bank, Jordan, and other countries. They don't like the fact that UNRWA exists. It is an organization that helps Palestinian refugees who were displaced since 1948. And the world has an obligation to address this issue, which is why President Biden really needs to push hard and set forth right now a practical path to achieve that two-state solution that he's talked about.
So, Senator, I don't know if you have been briefed on the president's plans. Apparently, we're coordinating with other European nations and others around this new port to bring aid and medical supplies and food to desperate Gazans more directly. I have to say, recently on my show, I had very powerful stories of a Palestinian-American doctor who lives in Chicago who went in and he worked over there and he said, you had limbs blown apart. You had a young child's jaw, boy's jaw blown away. They couldn't bring in the metal piece that they needed to replace this person's jaw. If they had been able to do it, they could fix these things right. He gave a lot of detailed, sort of high traction examples of what the inspections and blockages of certain supplies were coming in, and it really affected me in this. And so one of the questions I have is, are the materials and supplies that are going to be coming into Gaza going to be inspected in the same way? Are we going to begin to see something there? And I'm just interested in whether or not you've been briefed on how efficacious this effort will be. When you see 38,000 food baskets delivered and you realize the population is 2.1 million, you begin to wonder how much is theater and how much is real.
Well, you're right. I'm glad you had that doctor on your show. Dick Durbin, my colleague from Illinois, Senator Durbin, has been very much in connection, in touch with him. And those are just some of the horrible stories. Look, again, airdrops are good, but they're a drop in the bucket. Now, this new port facility will take apparently at least 45 to 60 days to get up and running.
45
to 60 days to get up and running.
That's something I had not heard yet.
The idea then would be to transport humanitarian assistance and food from Cyprus to this new port. Now, first of all, a lot of people can starve in 45 days. Secondly, it's going to be very important to have a distribution system at the other end here, because the Americans are not going to put boots on the ground. We come back to UNRWA. We need a distribution system in Gaza where people can actually deliver humanitarian assistance without themselves getting killed in the process, as we've seen on a number of occasions. So look, I'm for trying to get as much food and humanitarian relief into Gaza as possible. We need to. You have 2.2 million people, civilians, who are, some have starved to death, some are on the verge of starvation. So we need to do all these things, but there is no substitute for trucks coming across different crossings. And this is why when you see a graph over time of trucks, not getting anywhere close to the 500 trucks that were crossing before the war, and actually going down steeply, under 100 for many days at a time, when you see people like the finance minister Smotrich holding up for over 5 weeks flour at the port of Ashdod when you have starving people. When you have the police, the national security, the head of the police, Ben-Gvir, essentially telling protesters at Kerem Shalom who are trying to block food from getting into Gaza, that that's okay. And he's telling his police folks not to clear them away to allow food. When you see that, this is something that President Biden should say, this is unacceptable. And we have U.S. laws on the books that can be enforced to say that the United States will not be supporting a Netanyahu government with people like this in it doing those kind of things.
Senator, I asked a very senior Middle East leader recently, how could all of this get a lot worse? And this person said, if we don't get a ceasefire, a real ceasefire in place before Ramadan, watch out. That Ramadan can actually become a trigger of a far greater nightmare of desperate people moving across borders, of mobilized militaries potentially in Jordan and Egypt. And I'm just interested in whether that's on your radar screen and whether there's a sense of that kind of concern of an escalation of this, human nightmare that could lead other directions and to an expansion, if you will, of this conflict and what it means for the United States.
I think there's a very real risk of that. We need a ceasefire and we need a release of all the hostages. And the hope had been to get that done before Ramadan. Clearly, we're not at that point yet. And you have Prime Minister Netanyahu saying that they're still actively considering or have decided that there's going to be a major military operation against Rafah. This is, of course, the city in southern Gaza next to the Egyptian border.
It's a city whose population has swelled from 300,000 to 1.5 million people today, right?
That's exactly right. So 1.2 to 1.3 million people in Rafah today are there because their homes in other parts of Gaza were destroyed or they had to flee, and they were told to go to Rafah because this was going to be a safe place to go. This will take, if you ask me how a humanitarian nightmare can become even worse, it's hard to imagine it getting worse, launch a major attack against Rafah, and you will see that. In addition to all the other impacts that will have in the region in terms of other people getting engaged, the risk of other violence in other parts of the Middle East.
Do you think President Biden now is taking this seriously, or are we still seeing largely posturing? I think it's one of the things, as you and I both know the president, and I think the president largely is someone who does think seriously about foreign policy. It's hard for me to tell, however, this is my side of the story, on whether or not the recent actions are there as theater to respond to youth who are very disaffected by his posture, or whether President Biden has a real commitment to change things now.
So I think he's taking it seriously, but I don't think the Biden administration is taking it seriously enough. And I say this for this reason. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal just about 2 weeks ago that said the Biden administration was on the verge of notifying Congress that they were going to have another major shipment of weapons for use in Gaza, including bombs. So it is, in my view, incoherent as a policy to say, Prime Minister Netanyahu, you've got to allow more humanitarian assistance into Gaza. Prime Minister Netanyahu, make me a commitment that you're not going to go into Rafah. And at the same time, be planning on sending more weapons, which is why I and a number of us have called upon the president to utilize current law, which is called 620I of the Foreign Assistance Act. It's called the Humanitarian Aid Quarters Act, which says that you can't provide military assistance to a country that is restricting directly or indirectly U.S. humanitarian assistance into a conflict zone. By the way, it would not apply and would not cover Iron Dome and defense systems, but it would cover offensive systems like bombs being used in Gaza. It's also why I pushed for National Security Memorandum 20 and why it's really important that they implement National Security Memorandum 20. it's an important tool, but it's not a good tool if you're not willing to actually use it. So I would call upon the Biden administration to immediately apply and use National Security Memorandum 20.
Look, we're in the presidential election season. There are primaries going on. You just saw what happened in Michigan and Minnesota, where folks came in and they voted uncommitted rather than for Joe Biden, who is right at the head of that ticket. No doubt that President Biden will be nominated president ticket. But I guess my question is one, whereas if you look back, it's very rare that a foreign policy issue can be deeply consequential in a presidential election. It'll be inflation or other economic issues, how people feel about the economy. Do you think there's a real risk that if this conflict doesn't pivot in another direction, that President Biden might actually lose because of the frustration to President Trump?
So, Steve, I think this is a huge issue on voters' minds, especially as we've seen younger voters, Arab American voters in Michigan and others. And I fully respect and understand these voters.
I mean, you're not running this cycle.
Right.
But are you out hearing it in Maryland from your constituents?
Sure, I'm hearing it from young people. And, this is a case where just doing the right thing is also, in my view, the politically right thing to do. This is where our principles and politics should be aligned. And this is why I think the president needs to be doing more. I will say that I think the act of protesting by withholding your vote or voting for a non-candidate in the primary is a very important political expression of people's views. I do think it would be a huge mistake for those voters not to come out and vote for Joe Biden in November. For a whole host of reasons, both domestic and foreign. I will just remind people that President Trump cut off funding unilaterally to UNRWA.
I remember.
On his own initiative. It wasn't a congressional act. So, Donald Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu are in many ways two peas in a pod. And so I would just say that as much as people may disagree with the president's actions and proposals, and I have expressed my disagreements, it would be a disaster for the world and for America to reelect Donald Trump.
Well, I want to thank you for being here. I want to also thank you for being human and looking at real people in this conflict, because sometimes it's easy to forget them. So, U.S. Senator Chris Van Hollen from Maryland, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Steve.
So, what's the bottom line? Sure, the world is full of contradictions, but the contradiction we see from the United States right now, trumpeting that it's providing a port for the desperate Palestinians in Gaza, while at the same time doing just very little to forcefully stop Israel's attacks, is the kind of contradiction that simply can't pass without calling it out. So much time, so much money, and lives wouldn't have to be wasted and lost if Israel had just allowed the gate between Egypt and the Gaza Strip to open. And there are hundreds of trucks there right now at the border. And if America doesn't have the muscle to open a gate, but instead has to go over the water to reach those in need and to evade blocks by its own ally, how does President Biden really think he's going to deliver on a Palestinian state? Those are the contradictions that the whole world can see. And that's the bottom line.